Good morning and welcome to the Pearman Insight Hour. I've been doing these through the year and have attempted to tap into various topics that I think are vital to the talent management conversation. And today's topic is certainly one of those near and dear to the way I live, really, not just as an idea or set of ideas, but as you can see from the array of things over the years that I've created and I've created with others, including the work Bob Eichinger and I've been doing in the development of TeamTelligent products, is really an expression of my commitment to and love for innovation. We're going to take a look at aspects of innovation and power and in organizational life. We're going to tap into and do a drive-by related to some disciplines in innovation. We're going to look at a sort of a typical orientation toward power and how it shows up in organizational life and how we pay attention to various behaviors and in fact thread those through the organization. But to get us started in this exploration this morning, I'm interested, as you saw or responded to the topic, distributing power to foster innovation, I'm quite curious about your reaction to a couple of words. So if you will, in the chat space, give me a couple of associations or additional terms that you associate with the word power as it relates to sort of typical organizational life. What are the kinds of things when someone says power in the organization? What does that mean to you? Hierarchy, influence, the command chain, positional power, ability to get things done, all important words. And these are the kinds of associations I find when I ask people about power, that they typically will say, well, power means that we can get things done, or it means a person has considerable influence, or it means that where they sit in the organizational chart enables them to do things that others can't do. The word or phrase to foster is an interesting word, and I chose the word deliberately because of the fact that it is in a word that communicates that we're trying to promote the development of something or someone or some certain set of conditions. But I'm curious, when you hear the word foster, what as you think about organizational life and in organizations, when people say, well, we're trying to foster something in our organization, what do we really mean when we use those kinds of terms? What is it that we think fostering is all about? Yeah, setting the stage, getting folks invested, create the conditions for intentionality. Yeah, foster implies an intentionality to get something to move in a particular way, to encourage, to get things done. And I'm very intentional about using this word because I believe it's about the ways in which people behave in organizations that fosters the conditions for this to occur. And I think innovation, quite frankly, post-COVID health crisis, if there's ever going to be a post-COVID health crisis, there is going to be a greater need for renewal, restoration, rebuilding that's going to lean in on innovation. And I'm curious, when you hear that word, what strikes you as especially important or especially that you especially associate with the word innovation. Rethinking or extending. Okay. Innovations foster behavior change. And challenge to determine what needs fresh thinking. Reinventing, pivoting. Yeah, those are all helpful. Challenging the status quo. You know. It's fascinating to me over the years in working both as a chief operating officer in an organization, which when you think of financial services companies, you don't necessarily think of innovation, but actually we did some extraordinarily innovative things for the kind of company we were and in the kind of market that we were in. And I built a lot of my practices as an executive in a company on research that had been emerging on innovation, and especially research that was coming out of the Center for Creative Leadership, which happened to be down the street from the organization where I worked. There have been some very thoughtful people who say some things about innovation that's worth a pause on. In some ways, it seems simple that if you want something new, you have to stop doing something old. Peter Drucker is inviting us to pause, I believe, and ask ourselves, really, what are we wanting to give up in order to move into a new space, which may always be required. We've heard this quote from Einstein in all kinds of ways. You can't solve a problem on the same level you were at when you created it. The idea that if you want to innovate, you have to be willing to shift perspective. If you want to reframe, you have to be willing to come at an issue or a problem, or we could say, if we want to improve a service or improve a product, we have to approach it in some different ways. Author Clarke, widely known in research circles on leadership, said the only way to discover the limits of the possible is to go beyond them into the impossible. Clarke would argue that innovation requires us to push beyond what our current constraints are and our various challenges in the situation in which we find ourselves. Pollard made a very interesting observation in saying that learning and innovation go hand in hand. And he warns us that the arrogance of success is to think that what you did yesterday will be sufficient for tomorrow. And I think that's a very good warning, that we can become complacent in thinking that, well, what is there to innovate? After all, we've achieved the pinnacle of success in our particular operation or service. Deming, in thinking about innovation and thinking about quality and change in organizations, made the statement that the number one job of management is to stamp out fear. And he felt that because if there is fear in the culture, if there's fear in the enterprise, that in fact what tends to happen is people hold back, aren't willing to push into the impossible, aren't willing to see things in new and different ways, and that in fact we might want to give ourselves pause over what kind of culture we find ourselves in. Now, I have some cartoons that I have permission to share, and some of them are intended to really capture the idea of the culture that people find themselves in organizational life. And we've heard endlessly, and especially Zoom world today, where people are asking, can I somehow escape this particular condition in which I find myself? If we're in organizations where people trying to tell the truth results in being executed for it, and then there being a justification as everybody watches and listens to the manager at the top. Maybe the culture that folks are in is one where we want to include you in this decision without letting you affecting it. And that's a condition that we often see in organizational life, and one in which people feel like, well, why did you ask me if you really weren't going to listen to the suggestion that I had? And of course, while we may have, this is funny because when people are in cubicles in the office, well, now it's even more severe because people are often working from home from their own computer and could do so hours on end without on-the-job interactions, which is a threat to a culture being successful, especially in fostering innovation. If it's a culture where the rules, even any rules of engagement, are taken to their extreme, we can't call the ambulance. He doesn't allow personal calls on company time. There could be serious consequences for such a culture that we find ourselves immersed in. And then, of course, the one that seems most natural and shows up a lot is the notion that people pushing for change or innovation or adjustments of some form is called the blame. How do we blame them appropriately for it? Well, I want to get into the positive side of innovation by actually borrowing a line from our newly crowned Nobel Prize poet, Louise Glück, and that's actually how you pronounce her last name. And I remembered this line, and I thought, at least the way I think, is a beautiful, optimistic line that our ideas have possibility and potential to go to the far corners of the earth. When she, in this particular poem, says or asks the question, shall I be raised from death? The spirit asks, and the sun says yes, and the desert answers, your voice is sand scattered in wind. And when I read those lines, it says to me that by bearing witness to your ideas and possibilities and giving voice to them, they have the possibility and opportunity to be scattered around the world and to have incredible consequences, because as we all know, sand spread around the world can produce any number of pearls, as we might imagine. So in today's webinar, I want to talk some about organizations in general and what the different levels of organizations are and how that engenders certain kinds of roles and practices. I'm interested in toying around with the nature of power and how power is always present in organizations. It's inherent in organizational design. And the real question is, how do we artfully manage power to help the enterprise and the talent achieve what it has the capability of achieving? So we're going to take a look at these key concepts, and as it wraps itself around the notion of how we manage talent, and by taking a look at the nature of power and innovation and how it's distributed through the enterprise, I want us to be mindful of the roles and practices that in fact are at each level of organizational life, and then what are the kinds of things we do to help promote it. Different researchers and thinkers around innovation have made these statements that when it comes to innovation, it's not just the creation and development, but it's the implementation. And I'll tell you, that whole question of implementation is vital to understanding innovation. It's one thing to have an idea, it's another to see the idea come to fruition in a product that, in fact, is usable, or a service that is usable by others. Notice in the second quote, the idea of translating an invention into a good or service that creates value which customers are willing to pay for. That puts a higher standard as to what is innovation and how is it useful to us. And then the last one really simply says it's a process of creating value by applying novel solutions to meaningful problems. Again, it is not simply creating something, but it is that it is something that has value in the marketplace and it has a meaningful purpose and utility in the marketplace. We've seen innovation expand. It used to be around a particular service or a particular product. We now know, based on a host of writers and thinkers, that in fact, when we think about innovation, it comes in many forms in organizational life. Everything from the business model, how in fact the businesses may be networked in its particular market. It does certainly relate to product or service, but how it's distributed, and in fact innovations in customer engagement. So we now think of innovation as a broad range of possible areas of exploration. Now, a group of colleagues and I have been looking at this for about 30 years, the whole notion of innovation, and I want to just do a drive-by on several key ideas. One, that there are particular drivers in innovation that are almost always present in various degrees of importance, depending on where the organization is. There are disciplines to foster a mindset of innovation. There are disciplines related to working with and innovating with others. There are certainly disciplines related to how we try to move an enterprise and particular actions we take that we want, in fact, to get to the discipline of having innovation being a part of organizational life. We also know that there are always blocks to innovation. These blocks to innovation we are all aware of and have heard in many, many different ways as we think about seeing great ideas die on the vine because there was some key blocker, a blocker of perspective, a blocker of a leader in an organization or a manager, or a lack of prioritizing. Well, these things happen because of the nature of organizational life. And Barry Oshry was one of the first in the 80s and 90s to begin talking about power evident in the structure of organizations. He has, his work has been researched multiple ways. We now see in consulting psychology and in industrial psychology a widely accepted notion that as we look at the roles and the behaviors of folks at different organizational levels, that there are these three areas. And what's very important about this, and I think Oshry is really one of the first to make this point quite clear, that at each level you are in a kind of psychological bubble. Those at the top of an organization are in a certain bubble that's driven by various roles where they are believing that they're committed to and trying to care for the whole of the enterprise. Managers are in the middle with multiple roles, having to address, feeling torn between the influence of those at the top and maximizing the talent and skills of the individual contributors who are on the front line, either making products or delivering services that customers are willing to pay for. Now, what Oshry observed was everybody, no matter where they are, has some form of power in the organization, and the power in some ways is latent that some folks kind of ignore and don't pay attention to. Some power is assumed for a variety of reasons, and that in fact power plays to the benefit of the talent that's present, or can in fact sap the talent that's present and get in the way of promoting the kind of innovation climate that needs to be there. As I thought about this, it's my observation in organizational life that there are three arenas where power is most present, both exposed and hidden, meaning that we know when someone is the CEO of an organization that she or he has all kinds of power to make decisions and choices. That goes without saying. What we may not know is, in fact, what some of the political dynamics that could be going on amongst members of the senior team. What we know is that those dynamics will cascade through the organization. And so if we're going to make the best use of power for promoting and fostering innovation, then there are various things we need to pay attention to in the way resources get prioritized, and that's a political act. Likewise, dealing with conflicts of interest. Sometimes these are transparent and oftentimes not. People who are colluding with one another, and that doesn't necessarily mean it was an intentional collusion, but have colluded to become a barrier to innovation, may not fully understand what they're doing in holding an organization or a team back at some level. I find that power, especially as evident with the commitments people have, the loyalties they have in organizational life, is quite extraordinary. And I'll just give you a little pause of an exercise that for many, many years in a training program I facilitated on change, we would take a group of people and assign them a table and have them go through various exercises to build a table identity, a name, a logo, all kinds of things, while we were talking about change and transitions and giving them various pieces of insights. And so at the end of the day, of the first day, after they had firmed up an identity and solved some problems as a group, they were told change was coming. And the next day they came in, each table was given an envelope, and they were told something like, a member of this table will be moved. You have to decide who will be moved, and you have to do it in 10 minutes. Another team leader was told, you must decide who is going to move from this table. Well, it sounds simple, but the emotional energy plays out in every single case for 3 days over that act. And when you ask people, why are your emotions so caught up in having a person simply move a table in a room, it all comes down to emotional commitments. And it all comes down to the idea that I'm comfortable with, and we've developed a way of working together, and we like how we work together. We've developed our own little rituals. So you're asking us to make a change, and you are imposing a change on us. You are willful. You are using power in a way that we have not agreed to. And of course, it leads to all kinds of lessons about change and transition and power, and how it saps the group from being able to do the kinds of things that are necessary in order for the group to be innovative and to do effective things. So when you look at studies of power and the various folks who've written about power and influence, you'll see definitions like the ability to get something done in a particular way, or having a particular faculty, meaning a particular skill or capability. That in fact, it's the ability to get other people to do things, is in organizational life the most evident form of power. There have been various models. If you do research on this, you'll find that there are typical forms of power that are discussed. Legitimate, meaning that the organization itself has invested a person with certain kinds of power. that they are responsible for various tasks or various groups or various divisions within the organization. Coercive power is all about imposing punishments. As we know, expert power, and we see it play out in all kinds of ways, that those who have special knowledge or capabilities, and sometimes people with expert power, we would say, may actually show abuse of that power by not using other kinds of skills to enable them to enable their expertise to be as highly valued as it could be in organizational life. Certainly, we've seen or heard about the more what's called soft power around connections with people and or referent power having to do with essentially building collaborative networks in organizational life. And in fact, the holacracy movement, if you've ever paid attention to that movement of organizational structure, is built entirely on the referent power model, that we all have a commitment to the success of the enterprise, whatever your roles or responsibilities are, and we're not going to rely on a command and control system, but on a collaborative system. You might research that if you're really interested. Now, what's kind of fascinating is that when you start looking at the range and utilization of the use of power, that in fact it does show itself in a variety of ways at different levels of organizational life. So it is possible that an individual contributor could be given certain responsibilities and have a legitimate right to make certain decisions or make certain requests. So it's quite situationally driven for individual contributors. But we know managers and folks at the top of the organization, it's built into the system that there is legitimate power assumed for them to be able to make decisions, to set priorities and get things done. We know that expertise at the individual contributor level is very important. And as a person moves up in organizational life, their expertise may not be as significant. It's their capacity to lead and manage that becomes more important, which then leads to the other forms of power, being informationally oriented, using connection, reference, and making sure that they reward people for getting things done. So when we take a look at what are the primary forms of power, we know that all of them are evident at all levels, and in some cases more situationally driven. Now, this all being said, we don't teach people, gosh, we want you to use your expertise in a powerful way. We don't teach people, we want you to build connections so that you can have power in the organization. What we in fact do is encourage people to develop an array of behaviors which we call practices in our talent management system at TeamTelligent. And there's some practices which rely on these different bases of power, which when actively engaged have constructive and positive outcomes. Now, I believe that in this day and age, especially, any use of coercive power is seen as incredibly damaging to organizational life and certainly damaging to talent, the use of talent in organizations. So it's not anything that we have embedded in any of our practices, but these are the kinds of practices that we would say, when you're learning them and when you're using them, you're in fact exercising power that has a very constructive outcome that we know, based on hosts of research sources, are the kinds of things that create the conditions for innovation. Now, I'm going to talk in more detail about the kinds of practices across our system. But I want to remind everybody that knowledge, skills, and attributes is sort of the synthesis of saying there are particular kinds of knowledge and skills and attributes at the individual contributor level. at the manager level and at the leader level of organizations. And that in fact, when we start poking around into the high potential world, we know in fact there are things there that are quite, when fostered, elevate the opportunity for innovation, and various things that we do with teams are quite important for us to leverage the team for innovative outcomes. Now, I'm going to do a drive-by here simply to remind folks that within our levels, organizational levels, the libraries for our individual, the library for our individual contributor includes 10 roles, and I've put in red those roles which have, I'm going to say, direct roots in doing the kinds of things that foster innovative opportunities. That those are the kinds of things that folks at the individual contributor level have responsibility for, that when exercised in the most constructive way helps us create the conditions to foster innovation in at the organizational individual contributor level. The manager and supervisor level, you will notice there are more. There's more red here that says there's a lot that a manager does, which, if done effectively and well, will create the conditions. In fact, one of the roles that we found in our research that's vital for managers to own is contributing innovative conditions, making sure they're doing those things that foster the emergence of innovation, developing the kinds of, if you will, activities and responsibilities for folks so that innovation is possible across the spectrum of innovative issues that I identified earlier. And certainly at the leader level, where we've identified the 9 roles that absolutely must be fulfilled, over half of those roles actually, if fulfilled effectively, will promote an innovative climate. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to speak with a group of talent managers in South America and from Portugal, and one of the things they were fascinated with was to talk about how culture in an organization can, in fact, foster an innovative condition, and what are the kinds of behaviors and what does that actually look like? Well, there are very specific practices, and I've simply identified the 10 that are most impactful within each of the libraries, that we know when we get people engaged in these, that we are in fact promoting an innovative environment. We also know that when people are, for example, at the individual contributor level, when they're developing resilience to deal with all the challenges, that they are in fact using their personal power to be in a good place and to be open to collaborating and being open to, if you will, taking on challenges that will enable the organization to grow in new and different ways. Likewise, as we see with managers, we know that when managers are building resilience and strengthening their capabilities to be open-minded, that in fact they are going to work more collaboratively, communicate more clearly with individuals, and that will enable them to foster the kind of innovative spirit that organizations need. Likewise, at the leader level of organizational life, a very vital practice of leveraging innovation and making sure that innovation is a part of the overall nature of how we want to work together becomes very important from the top, threaded down through the organization. Now, in our system, in case this is an idea that you want to become more intentional about, we have coded the practices in each of the libraries to the kinds of experiences people have. And that's important because if there's a particular practice that you're wanting individuals to develop more deeply, and you're wanting individuals to get a deeper use of certain kinds of behaviors, and we can become intentional about the innovative behaviors, then we have to make sure their experiences are going to foster that. I've just highlighted in red and put a gold star by all of the experiences based on our analysis we know will foster the kind of mindset and the perspective that encourages an innovative approach to new and different, which is absolutely vital for innovation to be present in organizational life. In our look at potential, and it's funny, as I was thinking about this work, and as I think about how we want to encourage the elevation of potential, all of the markers, if you go do research on creativity and research on innovation, you'll find that almost in every single research, there is discussion about the role of aspiration in the innovator's head about what to achieve, wanting to achieve something that's great, new and different, wanting to, in fact, take on a variety of experiences and challenges and so forth. And so my point being that as you think about approaching a certain kind of talent problem in organizational life, then in fact, even if it's at the potential question, the practices there and the drivers there bring you comfortably around to innovative conditions. Now, teams are often thought of as the drivers of innovation. If you study innovation in organizational life, some of the big thinkers will tell you over and over and again that it's what you do with your teams that will make the biggest difference. It's what you do with making sure that your teams are engaged in the most collaborative way and the best use of the talent in a team that will lead to a culture of innovation within the team. And we know, for example, that having an inclusive and diverse environment all throughout organizations, but especially in teams, is where the greatest opportunity for innovative ideas to emerge and for teams to test those ideas and to get those ideas integrated into organizational products and services, which is vital. Now, in our teams library, as I've just mentioned, that we have particular drivers in very specific domains, all of which, when you're engaged in those and fostering those in teams, will encourage the innovative spirit. To get there, though, to thread it through organizational life, we have to be very intentional consultants, very intentional HR leaders, very intentional talent managers, in which we have to ask ourselves, what's the profile that we most need in our organization, and have we included in that profile, given our priorities, the kinds of behaviors that will in fact foster and encourage innovation? It is very possible that a key performance profile could be created, and when you start analyzing it and you start saying, well, gee, as we look at the key practices, they're almost all related to task-oriented kinds of things. They really aren't practices that will in fact foster the innovative spirit and innovative orientation. And so I strongly encourage people, when if innovation is a key priority in the organization, then not only when you think about the profile that's vital for effectiveness and for the organization to get to where it needs to be, you need to make sure and include in that profile, in a very intentional way, the kinds of practices that will in fact foster the conditions for innovation in the organization. Now, I happen to think of our system as a talent operating system. I've been calling it the TOS, meaning you maybe you don't have a whole system, but you only have a part of, and that's okay. Wherever you start, wherever the pain point is, there are resources to help take a look at, is it a feedback issue? Is it a, how do we foster succession planning? How do we create a talent pipeline? How do we help our teams? How do we interview effectively? All those kinds of things are part of the initiative to find the talent who will use power effectively in organizations to help create the conditions for innovation. We have to select the roles and practices that will do that. We need to assess the current situation and ask ourselves, are we promoting those things that foster innovation? Are we promoting those activities that will encourage an innovative orientation to looking at and looking freshly at our products, services, our approach, our business model? And are we integrating those things throughout the organization, throughout the culture, in the ways that I've suggested, in the ways I've talked about, the roles and practices that are vital? Here are some of the sources that I've relied on to poke around in the role of power and innovation today. And you'll get those in a PowerPoint, a PDF that looks at some of the key ideas. And if you haven't taken a look at what's coming up next, my last hour on talent management this year is really on the nature of questions. On Friday, November 13th, I'm going to be inviting folks to take a look at the ways in which our questions promote development, how our questions nurture, how our questions enable us to hire those who are going to be the most effective in organizational life. And we won't be able to answer those questions about why questions matter and how we might ask questions in the most effective way without having a stop by, if you will, some of the programs operating in each and every one of us related to the way our brains operate. I know all of you know that you can reach us on the website. You also know we have a LinkedIn page, and happy to have you connect with us on that page to share and react to different ideas.